screaming George, even though you just beat BJ Penn in an outstanding fight. What's on your mind right now?
I don't think George is hurt. I think he's scared. I think he's scared to fight everybody right now. What's up? Where you at, George?
Nick Diaz, one of the most prolific and iconic MMA fighters, due to his no fucks given attitude. Nick Diaz has recently been in headlines for wanting to fight again after his loss to Robbie Lawler in 2021. Nick has called for the likes of Alex Pereira or Israel Adesanya, the champ and the #1 contender in the UFC middleweight division.
When can fans expect you back?
I'm asking to fight as soon as possible.
As soon as you can? Are you the man?
Yeah, not John Jones though.
But you want like an Izzy or Pereira at 185?
Yeah.
You want Izzy?
Something like that. Yeah, that's fine, you know.
You want the champ at
I
middleweight?
always want to fight the best, you know.
Right.
The purpose of this video is to discuss whether Nick Diaz can still compete at the highest level. Before that, I would like to provide a bit of backstory on who Nick Diaz is, his resume, and whether or not he can still compete. For my casual friends who don't know, Nick Diaz was born in Stockton, California. He has a younger sister and a younger brother that some people may know. His name is Nate Diaz.
Hey, I'm not surprised, motherfuckers.
Nick got into martial arts at a young age, starting off with karate and aikido. He got into sambo at the age of 16 and eventually started to train MMA under Steve Heath at the Animal House Gym before joining Cesar Gracie's gym. Nick Diaz's life was full of tragedies. His father was barely around, and before his professional MMA debut, his girlfriend sadly committed suicide. Nick has stated that after her death, he would visit her grave and tell her that he would become the fighter she always wanted him to be. Nick Diaz has fought in quite a lot of promotions, so I will try and highlight his highest moments in each promotion, so forgive me if I seem to skim over them. Nick Diaz had his professional MMA debut in 2001 at the age of 18 at IFC Warriors Challenge 15. He eventually gained the IFC Welterweight Championship in July of 2002. Diaz later won the WEC Welterweight Championship in 2003. After this, he went back to the IFC to defend his belt against Jeremy Jackson, a guy who beat him a year prior. Diaz won the match via TKO and was eventually signed to the UFC in September of the same year. Nick Diaz had his first fight in the UFC at UFC 44, where he beat Jeremy Jackson by armbar in the 3rd round, thus completing their trilogy. He later fought Robbie Lawler for the first time at UFC 47, which in my opinion was Nick's best performance at the time. He trash-talked and taunted Lawler the entire fight until the eventual KO. Taunting is a characteristic that will follow both Diaz brothers in their fights. After this, Diaz fought 6 more times in the UFC before being dropped due to having 3 consecutive losses. In this run, he went 2-4, mainly losing by close decisions. This 6-fight run consisted of Caro Parisian, Drew Fickett, Koji Oshii, Diego Sanchez, Joe Riggs, and Sean Shirk. After being cut from the UFC, Diaz participated in the Cage Fighting Organization, defeating Ray Steinbest in his first fight. Before his second fight at Cage Fighting Organization against John Alizio, the UFC called him the night before to fill in for Thiago Alves in his fight against Josh Neer at UFC 62. He went on to submit Josh Neer that night, then went on to fight Gleison Tebow at UFC 65 and won by KO. Diaz was seemingly back in the UFC but decided to sign with Gracie Fighting Championship. However, that fight was canceled due to low ticket sales. He had a 2-fight run in Pride that was filled with controversy, as his fight with Takanori Gomi was dubbed a no contest, as Nick tested positive for one of the worst performance-enhancing drugs ever: marijuana. It was only a metabolite too. These dudes are fucking with my boy Nick Diaz. After the BS from Pride FC, Diaz bounced around Elite XC and Dream before eventually fighting in Strikeforce. I believe that Nick Diaz reached stardom in Strikeforce, beating the likes of Frank Shamrock in his debut. Diaz later won the Strikeforce Welterweight Championship by defeating Mariusz Zamrowski. He defended the belt a total of 3 times against the likes of KJ Noon, Cyborg Santos, and Paul Daly before vacating and signing with the UFC once again. UFC President Dana White made it official by confirming that Nick Diaz would fight welterweight champion and member of the GOAT Mount Rushmore, George St. Pierre. White later switched out Diaz with Carlos Condit, as Diaz missed multiple press events for the fight. Diaz would instead fight former double champ BJ Penn. Diaz would win the fight via unanimous decision and provide one of the most iconic quotes in a post-fight interview.
Nick Diaz by unanimous decision.
Diaz would then be put up against Carlos Condit for the interim welterweight championship. Interim meaning while the champ sits out for an injury or anything else, the interim belt means you are the definite #1 contender. Diaz would lose the fight against Condit by decision. Diaz was infuriated with the decision and claimed to retire from the sport.
Shit, you know what I mean? I pushed this guy backwards the whole time. He ran for me the whole fight. That was the way they understand how to win in here. I don't want to play this game no more. I'll help out my team and my brother and everybody else. I'm out of this.
A while later, there were talks of a rematch between Diaz and Condit, but that was later refuted when Nick Diaz tested positive for marijuana once again. Diaz was then suspended for 1 year due to his test result. At UFC 158, March 16th, 2013, Diaz finally got the title fight with St. Pierre. Leading up to this fight, Diaz had a lot of iconic moments at their press events.
George likes to say I remind him of the bullies that picked on him growing up or they had to deal with. You know, I'm going to say, like, how many times you had a gun to your head, George? How many times someone put a gun to your head? They're selling you all wolf tickets, people. You're eating them right up. George here is selling you wolf tickets. Dana here, he's selling you wolf tickets. The UFC is selling you some wolf tickets.
Diaz unfortunately lost the bout against George via unanimous decision. It would take almost 2 years for Diaz to turn to action. His comeback fight was against one of the GOATs, Anderson Silva. The fight would later turn to a no contest as both fighters tested positive. Nick once again, for the third time, tested positive for marijuana. This time, Diaz was slapped with a 5-year suspension and fined $165,000. Diaz would appeal this decision and get the fine reduced to $100,000 and an 18-month suspension. After many more troubles with athletic commissions for fines and USADA for not reporting his whereabouts, Diaz was slated to fight in September of 2021 against Robbie Lawler in a rematch from their first bout back in 2004. Leading up to the fight, Diaz seemed shaken or unconfident in himself.
Do you think?
Well, it never started. I fight, and then everybody benefits, and I don't. I get paid to fight, and then I fight, and I don't enjoy fighting. I don't, I have to concentrate on the fight to be the best fighter. And then, I'm supposed to do all this other stuff that the other fighters do, and then it's like I'm being punished for not being a regular human being or a regular person.
And the fight had to be moved from 170 pounds to 185, as Diaz was not in shape for the fight, which was a drastic change compared to his Instagram post earlier in the year. Diaz lost the fight against Lawler, but showed some promise, despite him being out of shape and gassing out quite early. After the fight, there was a lot of questions as to what was going on with Nick. Even his opponent, Robbie Lawler, came up to him directly after the fight and asked him if he was okay. A month after the fight, Diaz's physical therapist said that Diaz was stressed, overtrained, and exploited in the fight camp leading up to the fight. It was then revealed in 2022 by his coach that Nick had a severe neck injury going into the fight. And just recently, Nick Diaz went onto a podcast and talked about how he wasn't ready for the Lawler fight and that he wasn't going in there to win. Many fans took to Twitter to slam Diaz by saying all these reasons were excuses and that Nick only complains. But it all seems to make sense as to why Diaz did not perform as well as he should have. Many of the interviews showed that something was mentally off about Diaz, and the drastic change from 170 pounds to 185 further proves that Diaz's training was hindered. All that being said, Diaz did vow to be back in 2023, which brings me into the main topic of the video. Nick Diaz seems to be in good health mentally and physically now, and has asked for a fight with either middleweight champion Alex Pereira or former middleweight champion Israel Adesanya. Diaz is 39 as of the upload of this video, and it makes sense why many would tell Diaz to retire with his older age, and his last fight not being too impressive. In my professional YouTuber opinion, I believe Nick can still compete. However, against high-level fighters, I am not too sure. If Nick is in good health, he should have a tune-up fight against one of the lower-ranked fighters in the top 15, as I believe middleweight is kind of a weak division once it gets below top 4-ish. Nick should fight either Chris Curtis, who's ranked 14, or Kelvin Gastelum, ranked 15. Curtis is mainly a striker, so this will show if Diaz can still compete in the stand-up. Kelvin is a great fighter who has fallen off a little bit, but has great wrestling and cardio, so this can also be a great fight for Diaz. I understand that Diaz wants one last run at the title, and with his name value, he can add something to a championship fight and sell pay-per-views, but many of his fans, myself included, don't really want to see him get destroyed by the upper echelon of the division. Unless Nick Diaz can show us something against a lower-ranked fighter, I believe he can't jump right into the top dogs, and in all honesty, he doesn't need to. He has had a great career, iconic fights, and moments that us fans will never forget. There is nothing left for Diaz to prove, and I believe he accomplished exactly what his late girlfriend wanted him to accomplish. He became a great fighter.